The following program is intended for mature audiences.
Shalom and welcome to the SINagoguge. This is a podcast for consenting adults for information, education, and entertainment on BDSM, sexuality, and all things related. If you're not a legal, enthusiastically consenting adult, then
pick up the needle, press pause, or turn the radio off.
For those who remain, now might be a good time to switch to your headphones.
Welcome to the SINagoguge. I am your host, and they call me the Rabbi.
Pretty fly for a rabbi.
I put the sin in synagogue, and I am a cisgender, ambimorous, gynesexual, sadistic, bratty, daddy doll. Sex therapist by day, kink educator by night, and in both these roles, I help people make their kink a religious experience. While I am a mental health professional, this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not a replacement for therapy. Seek out the assistance of a trained professional for help with your specific situation. Hosting with me today is my partner, my ADHD squirrel wrangler, my submissive, my brat, my pony, or just my little pony. Aww. The Venus to my Serena. Little bit.
Oh my goodness.
This is episode number 25, and with us today is Dr. Rachel and Kieran to talk to us about helping professionals in the scene and in the lifestyle. Guess what? Helping professionals are kinky too, and if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you already know that. But we also hear horror stories of experiences with providers around kink or other parts of our identities. Let's talk first about the appropriate and inappropriate roles of professionals in the kink world, and then let's talk about kinky therapists, polypsychologists, dominant doctors, queer chiropractors, masochistic, massage therapist, caregiver, CNA, and how we live and work in the spaces where we take on a helping role. You did not make that easy for me to read.
I love it, though. That might be the best intro I've ever been given. That's fantastic.
How to manage relationships with differing roles and boundaries requires time, attention, and intention. How do we do it all? And what do we keep for ourselves? But first, a word from our sponsor. Dr. Rachel and Kieran is a licensed psychologist, owns Storybrooke Therapy and Consulting, where they focus on sexuality, gender, and relational diversity, neurodiverse and disability-affirming practice, body liberation, social justice, and trauma-informed care. She trains other mental health professionals on competence with marginalized populations. She's been featured in podcasts and conventions. Dragon Con was memorable. Frolicon is a fave. Sharing the importance of destigmatizing sexual, gender, and relational diversity with professional and public audiences. Thank you for being here in the SINagoguge. Let's talk about helping professionals in the scene and in the lifestyle.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. I love talking about this topic. It is one of my absolute favorites because, as you so beautifully put, therapists are kinky too, and are people too, right? We don't only exist in our offices, and so our identities intersect with those of our clients, often in a lot of ways and in surprising ways. And figuring out how to navigate that can be particularly challenging. I think.
Yeah, part of my personal mission is to educate other therapists. So when I've been asked to speak at groups, this is always the question they come to me asking, like I know what I'm doing with it. I'm like, I'm making it up as I go along too. I'm taking a little bit from here, a little bit from there. So what's your take?
That's a great question. Well, my take on so many things is that the most powerful thing I can know is that I don't know everything. And so I tell people all the time, I worry about being labeled the expert. You know, people will be so eager to say, oh, this person is an expert. And I joke that very early in my career, I was asked to do workshops on stress management. And I would say, well, I'm very happy to come into the room and be an expert on stress. I'm real good at stress. I don't know that I'm the expert on stress management, but I'll talk about what I've tried so far and how it's working out.
Sure.
And I think that's really important for whatever we're talking about, is to say, listen, I know some things. I've been fortunate enough to be doing this work for coming up on 20 years now. And at the same time, the thing that I know more than anything else is that there's no one size fits all for anything. For therapy, I think this is true in the kink world too, right? That the thing that works for one person isn't going to work for another person. And so the most unifying concept that I can come to, either as a therapist or as a kinkster myself, or as somebody who's involved in consensual non-monogamy, or any number of places in my life, is the importance of listening and finding out what people need, engaging with people in consensual ways and making sure that I've got that, and communicating with them. That's not that different than what I was taught to do as a therapist, getting consent for therapy, communicating with people about who are you, what do you need, what's going to work for you. So I love that crossover, but it's also a lot of work. If we're going to do any of this well, I joke with people all the time, being a good partner, being a good kinky partner, being a really great, it doesn't really matter what side of the slash you're on, but doing it well takes a lot of work. Talking, listening, thinking, planning, sometimes letting go of nerves or the need to control or whatever is going on for us. It takes a lot of work, and that is part of what I mean when I say we approach everything with intention, that we don't just run on autopilot. We don't just say, oh, that's the way we've always done it, so let's just keep doing that, because I think that's that's my least favorite answer for anything. But instead we say, well, what might work for me? What might be the best answer for me? So when I talk to people about the idea of not only being a therapist who primarily works with folks who are engaged in either consensual power exchange in relationships or just diverse arrangements, anything that's outside of the stereotypes that societies promulgate or pressure us to conform to, I just talk about that idea of intention, choosing what works for us as individuals and for the relationships that we're in, and then figuring out how to deal with the complicated edges and interactions between people, wants, needs, desires. There's no easy answer. That may feel like a very vague answer, but I hope it makes some kind of sense.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, I was going to say it made perfect sense to me too.
A lot of times the people that are doing this work, and not just therapy, I don't mean therapy, I mean engaging in relationships that aren't informed by, like, say, the relationship escalator, the idea of that you have to do relationships in a particular order or that they have to have a particular meaning. Once you break free of that, once you break free of, I have to be married with 2 kids, or I have to be anything heterosexual, I have to be a cisgender, I have to be in a particular gender role or power role in my relationship, you're left with a lot of questions. But the people who have broken free of that and said, wait, what works for me, often understand that idea of being really intentional and living in the questions really well. And some days they want days where they're like, oh, I'm tired. I don't know if I want to do the difficult questioning today.
That's fair. So as you're coming up with your personal policy, what kind of things does somebody need to take into account?
Oh, in relationships, you mean?
Their professional kink boundary.
Okay, so we're talking about dealing with being around other professionals. That's a really hard one, I will say that. And so when I talk about this, or when I think about like helping professionals in the lifestyle, first of all, I always want to make it really broadly based, right? Obviously, so I'm a therapist, and my training has always been in specifically psychotherapy. So like mental health, working with people who may be dealing with, depression, anxiety. Lately, it's more and more stress because we live in an incredibly stressful world. We're impacted by systems that are designed to be hurtful to people, and we're all dealing with that and with the impact of that. But I also want to recognize the idea that helpers, there's a model for helping that I really love that describes this, that there's 3 elements you need for a helping relationship. Somebody who's in need of help, so somebody who's struggling, a person who is willing to offer that help, so a designated person sufferer, a designated helper, and some kind of ritual through which, process through which that help is going to be offered. And if we use that really basic archetype, there's helpers everywhere, right? Some people get paid to help. Some people do it as a vocation, an avocation. For some people, it's connected with a community role, a family role, all kinds of things. But no matter where our helping is coming from, or whether it is in physical health care, mental health care, teaching and education, a community role, right? I see so many helpers in our kink communities, in our queer communities. We all have to think about, what can I do? What's meaningful for me personally? Because so often people want to help. They want to serve their community. They want to help advocate. I think that's a big one really lately for people. How can I advocate for people who are struggling in my world, in my community? How can I advocate for people who may be harmed? But often in our rush to help, we don't think about, where do I need to set the boundaries for that? Where are the edges of my ability to help? When do I need to say no? Because I have run out of resources, because pushing past that boundary might potentially hurt myself or some part of my world, my relationships, my other roles or passions. Or where do I need to set a boundary? Because if I use up all my resources today, I won't be able to get up and do this work again tomorrow. So I talk with people a lot about the idea of figuring out what sustainable helping looks like. Because I could get up tomorrow and spend all day, for example, I'll talk about my version of helping, doing therapy with people for free. I could go from sunrise to sunset, or even longer than that because it's winter and it gets dark early. I could be doing therapy all day for 16 hours until I absolutely collapse. But if I do that on a Monday, I'm not going to wake up on Tuesday morning ready to go and do it again. So I have to think about, okay, my boundaries are, I don't do more than 5 or 6 sessions in a day. I take a lunch break so that I will be a little more refreshed for my afternoon sessions. And I think we have to think that even when we are doing something that is not as obviously a job, it might be, I'm on a committee in my community. I'm helping organize munches. I am helping mentor new members of my community. When do we have to say, I actually can't do all of that. I can't do everything. If I do, I'm going to damage myself or impact my ability to continue doing things. So that's one of the things that I think is really important. The other one is then if I have a profession, like for example, I'm a therapist, where are the boundaries there? So I have been for a very long time, many years ago, I was starting a private practice. I had worked in a corporate profession for a long time, and I was starting my private practice, and a member of one of our local community groups, in this case it was a polyamory group, got my cards, and they knew me as a person and said, wait, so you're like a polyamory friendly therapist? And I said, yes, you know me, you know that I am. And this person looked at me and said, can I give your cards to people? And I said, yes, please. That would be great. I'm starting a new practice, so having clients would be wonderful. Please feel free to give my cards to people. That community and related communities absolutely built my practice. I am now in this fortunate position where I work with almost exclusively with members of our polyamory and kink communities in the area I live in, also in some further afield, thanks to virtual work. So it's great. I get to work in my community all day, every day. But it meant that I had to start and think about, well, what do those boundaries look like? What happens when I offer to be present at, for example, the convention that's pretty centered around kink that I first met this person at? What happens when I go and I offer to teach a class on things like handling conflict in relationships, which is something that I often do to try to help people have more tools and skills. I'll often teach stress management classes, all those kinds of things. So, okay, I am at a kink event. This is a public-facing event. It's not therapists only. So there are lots of people, many of whom might be my clients. Well, what do I do then? And I often joke with clients, I say, okay, so do you think that if we're both in that space, am I going to walk up to you and say, hi, remember me? I'm Rachel. I'm your therapist. Fortunately, my clients understand that I'm not going to do that. But there are lots of subtle ways that I might violate their confidentiality, which of course I'm not going to do because I could lose my job and they could sue me for malpractice for that. But thinking about what's best for them and for me as another member of the community in that situation became really important. It became something that another therapist who doesn't work in a small marginalized community may not have had to think about. So I had to develop a whole policy around what do I do in the dungeon? So much so that I even wrote it up and put it on our website. So I tell my clients now, I say, hey, there's this event coming up. Are you going to be there? Are you looking forward to it? What's that going to be like for you? And then I say, hey, I'm teaching a class there this year. I want to tell you what to expect from me if I'm going to be at that event so that you don't have to worry that you are going to be in the middle of a really intense scene that you might be really excited about and really anticipating. And then out of the corner of your eye, you see that your therapist has walked into the room. And the last thing I want is for that to impact somebody's headspace when they might be in this really beautiful, transcendent moment and then be pulled out of that worrying what their therapist is going to think about them. So now I tell people beforehand, I say, listen, if that happens, if I walk into a dungeon or a play space and one of my clients is engaged in a scene and I notice that, I just turn around and I walk back out so that people can have that space and that experience in whatever way that they need.
I like that policy. That sounds very respectful, not just for your clients, but also for you as a professional. I mean, even more so for your clients, or seeing them in that space and letting them have that space.
Mm-hmm. Well, so thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I like it too. And as I said, I've been doing this for a lot of years, so I had time to think about that and figure it out. The piece about that, there's two things that are complicated about that. One is the very first time it happened, I didn't have a policy yet. I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't thought about what happens when, because it just hadn't occurred to me yet. And so I was a policy that I did have to create eventually after it had happened once, and I handled it on the fly. And I was like, oh, how do I feel about how I handled that? I had to talk about it with my client and say, hey, how was that for you? And I always talk through and debrief with people after this has happened about, did you notice that? How was that? How did you feel? The other thing that's tricky about this, though, is that's my policy for me. That's Rachel's policy that works for Rachel. And one of the things that I will tell my clients, which is a little bit of self-disclosure, and it might be more self-disclosure than other people would give, is I'll say, hey, listen, I'm not a person who needs public play because that's just me personally. Even if I wasn't a therapist, that would be true for me. And so I don't have to figure out, what if I'm in the middle of a scene in a dungeon or a play space and one of my clients walks in. For me, that's not a question I have to parse. And some days that feels a little bit like cheating, because I know plenty of other therapists for whom that's not true. So they have to face the difficult question of, okay, what does my boundary for that look like based on my personal needs, which are different? So it's very easy for me to say, oh, here's my policy. Here's what everybody should do as I do. But I don't think that's true, because not everybody's going to have the same need that I have. This can become really complicated for other folks when they're like, well, but I want to have time for public play, or I want to have a complicated scene that can only happen in a well-equipped dungeon. And how do I do that when the community that I serve and where I work professionally is also the community where I exist personally? That's really hard. I know people who fly to other states to get those needs met.
Yeah.
But it's a privilege to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the reason I enjoy teaching, is so I can get away from home and, do the dungeon play that I'm not comfortable doing, within 20 miles of my residence.
Yeah.
So, yeah, road trip is one way to handle it.
Yeah. And it's not something that everybody has the luxury of being able to do, but I think it means that there's no easy answers to this, but we keep going back to that idea of, okay, how do we deal with potential dual relationships? How do we deal with, the potential for having dual relationships or dual roles in our community, and recognizing that that's going to happen to everybody at some point? It's not just that we don't ever have dual roles, but that when they come up, that we deal with them in the best way possible. And I won't, because this would be so boring, but for many of us, we do regular ethics trainings, and we talk about ethical decision-making models, and we are trained and taught to consider many ways to make those decisions. How might this impact my clients? How might this impact the public around me? How might this impact me as a clinician? It's not as simple as saying, well, this is what I want to do, so I'm going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But it is hard, because we all hold so many different identities, and often those identities conflict. They want different things, right? My professional identity might want me to, be very buttoned up and put together and teaching all the time. And my personal identity might want to, just sleep for a week.
You mentioned, trying to make sure things don't conflict, between your personal and professional identity, and, trying to maintain those boundaries. I was just thinking of something that was, as I was going through certain things with my master's program, they had discussed about ethical things, such as, like, if you're out at a bar and you see a client who is, seeing you or seeing something, but you're part of their care team and they're in recovery or something like that, and you're having a drink and they're having a drink, is that an ethical conflict? And I'm like, wow, and applying that to kink, that's also, one of those things where I'm going, all right, so we're both here. Is that an ethical conflict?
That's such a great example of the convolutions of the kinds of ethics questions we're asked. I'm having grad school flashbacks just thinking about that. But
sorry.
I love it. I love it because, it really does. It connects us to the kinds of things that we worry about. Like I don't think the worst case scenario is I'm present and my clients are present. Like, on the one hand, that's pretty predictable because my clients kind of know that I'm a member of this community and that I may be in the space in an education role, in a volunteer role, things like that. that example, I think really pulls to the idea of like, what if I see my client in public and I see them engaging in something that worries me for them, that is directly related to something that we have talked about in our work together. I think the idea of recovery is a real clear example of like, what if I'm working with someone who says that they are, trying to be in recovery from a substance, and I see them out engaging with that substance.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is certainly not to be like, aha, I've caught you out. That's not going to do anything for our therapeutic relationships with people. But we might be really worried. Like, hey, what's going on? How's this impacting you? And I could see that happening in a dungeon, in a scene, at an event, seeing somebody and saying like, hey, I was worried about you because I care about you.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened and I had this reaction. And I think that's a really great example of the kind of situation where I find myself turning to my professional colleagues and needing their support and needing to talk through those kinds of questions. In our professions, we talk so much about the importance of consulting because, well, let me jump back. We talk about the idea of bias. And I think we have this idea that we can be totally objective, or maybe historically we used to have this idea that somehow we can be totally objective and non-biased. We can't. We are all products of the story that got us to where we are today.
Right.
And those stories come with us. We try not to center them. As a therapist, when I'm in the room with a client, it's not about me. But that doesn't mean that me isn't in the room.
Sure.
And so I might have reactions to things. I might have strong reactions to things that are based not on what's going on with my client, but something I've experienced. And so if I notice that, I'm going to go talk to my colleagues. And I'm so fortunate. When I first started doing this work, I was one of the only kink-aware therapists in my local area, or one of very, very few. So I didn't have a lot of other people to connect with, to consult with, to talk to about these challenges. Now I have this incredibly robust network of colleagues who I consider my friends to call and talk to and say, hey, I had this really strong reaction. I need to talk through it. I need to figure out if this is my reaction, if this is about my client. I want your opinion. I want to talk through the potential ethical dilemma. I want to know what you think, maybe before I go talk to my client about it. And I think that's really a strength of, I think the information age has unlocked a lot of things. The fact that we are able to talk on the internet about, we have so much more connection. I mean, we're talking over the internet on a podcast about this. It's amazing.
True.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely understand what you're talking about. There is one part-time sex therapist within, 40 miles of where I am.
Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, being able to reach out through the internet to people I've met like you at events or had classes with or whatever is a great resource for me, because I am definitely an island.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that I joke all the time that, I mean, for anybody who does not know this, I am very close to Metro Atlanta. So even though I kind of live out in the suburbs now, essentially I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. So that's a big metropolitan area.
Sure.
But I joke that I am a rural psychologist. And I have a friend who's a specialist in rural psychology who works in a very small town and who teaches about the ethical issues in those places. And the first time I told him this, he looked at me, he's like, Rachel, what are you talking about? You live and work in Atlanta. You are not a rural psychologist. And then I described the experience of being part of a marginalized community and being a provider for marginalized communities within marginalized communities, right? The queer community, the kink community, the polyamory community, and how the overlapping circles mean that the communities are smaller and smaller. And as I described this, eventually he looked at me and said, hey, guess what? You are a rural psychologist, because everybody knows everybody else, just the way you described with this therapist who's also the partner of a client's partner, that the resources available, for a referral sometimes get smaller and smaller. And so we need to be able to reach out more broadly. Or we need to understand that sometimes we can't. There are folks working in very rural places. I happen to be able to get to connect with some of them through the grad school I went to, folks who work in terrifically small towns in some of the plain states. And they talk about, listen, I can't change the fact that I am the therapist for the person who does my physical every year. That's just not something I can change in this town that I work in. So I'm going to have to do something different than a person who works in a large town where they can just go to a different doctor. And so we can use those models, and I found that really helpful in figuring out how we reconcile that sometimes I'm going to be in spaces that my clients are in, and that's okay. We talk about it, we think about it. I talk with my clients about, how do you feel about that? How do you want me to handle that? And sometimes they'll make requests that I may or may not be able to accommodate. Some days clients will want to introduce their whole family to me, which is great. Some days they will want to not, I joke that I don't catch people's eyes because I'm not going to break anybody's confidentiality. But some days they will not catch mine either, and other days they'll be excited to see me, and that's okay.
So when you're out in public, or the dungeon, I should say, that's not necessarily public.
Sure.
Who do you find you're more responsible to, yourself or the client?
Oh, that is a great way to ask that question. I think for me personally, when I walk into a dungeon, particularly at a bigger event, because I know that there's going to be a larger number of people there, the first thing that I personally do is my eyes tend to kind of glance over who's in the room. And I do think in that moment I am scanning for familiar faces, because I do have this I have my auto response. I have my policy of, okay, if one of my clients is here and they're engaged in a scene, I'm going to give them that space and walk back. I imagine that would be different, though, if I was walking into the dungeon about to set up for a scene of my own. Because I am not a public play person, I don't have to do that. So if I put myself in the headspace of, some of my colleagues who are wanting that, they might feel differently. Their first scan of the dungeon might go differently. I don't want to answer on behalf of all therapists working in this population. But so for me, there's definitely a piece of, I am holding some responsibility to my clients in those moments. I'm just looking around, what's going on around me, who's here. Is there somebody who might need a little small piece of my caring? But I am also paying attention to and thinking about, what do I need? Because certainly there are moments where I talked about the idea of sustainable caring. There are moments when my resources are low. There might be moments, and this has happened at events because I'm neurodiverse, and I have moments where I can't socially engage, where my batteries, my spoons are too low. And there might be moments where I realize that even if a client of mine does come up to me, does want to say hello, if I know that I don't have the resources to respond to that, then maybe I need to take myself away. So I have to be monitoring my needs as well, which is not something that we always think about when we're engaged with, what does my client need? So it's hard work to be paying attention to everybody's needs at all of these moments. The other thing that I don't know if you noticed this too, but I think the families of therapists learn not to ask questions, because partners can't lean in and say, hey, how do you know that person? So my family knows not to ask.
Mm-hmm.
That, they're not, hey, who is that? How do you know that person? I'm like, no, you don't get to ask that question.
Mm-mm.
I'm not going to tell you. I'm also not going to not tell you because that then is complicated. So they've just learned not to ask. So that's helpful too, is having people around you that won't make the situation even more complicated.
Yeah. My family is great with that. My dad's a psychologist. My mom's a psychoeducational specialist. So, yeah.
You grew up knowing some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think you can lose credibility with a client if you run into them at an event? And here's why I asked that question. Before I went back to school for the whole therapy thing, I worked in a factory. I was fairly new in the kink community. And after I found that out, I had trouble respecting him as an authority because I'm a D-type. He's a submissive. If I have to follow his orders, that makes me twice as submissive, and that's not me at all. I mean, I worked through it like an adult, but,
I think that's a great challenge. Like, there's a part of because I like to okay, I'm going to say something that isn't going to mean what it sounds like. Because I like to play with power, and I mean that as my therapist self, not as my kinky self, although there's some crossover there, definitely. But I think being able to understand that one can be submissive and also an authority in another area, it can feel counterintuitive. And yet that's such a great example of a place that we have to work through. This person has knowledge and authority in my professional journey, even though they would be in a different role were we engaged in our kink community, although obviously that person would never be engaged in that role with you, because that would really blend the boundaries way too much. So yes, I think that certainly that could happen, right? I think there's people who could see, there are clients that could see me do anything, and that thing could have meaning for them that meant that they lost respect for me. A client could see me choosing to get a package from Amazon, which it does happen. I'm not always proud of it, but it does happen, rather than buying from an independent retailer. And they could say, I just can't, like, my values are not in alignment. I can't work with you. If that's the decision that they need to make, if that is what is most meaningful and important to them, that's their choice. Do I love that? No, I don't know if that would feel great to me as a therapist. I think it doesn't necessarily represent the whole of who I am and could potentially be for them, but people get to make their own choices. And if that's something that someone can't get past, it could happen, but I can't run my whole life or presentation when outside of my house worrying that might happen. I talk to people a lot, because I'm a therapist, I talk to people all the time about values and doing things in ways that are aligned with their values, right? Like, are you living in a way that lines up with what you believe is right? Are you being, if your value is compassion, are you being compassionate to the people in your life, to yourself? Whatever your highest value is, it's different for every person, but are you living in a way that's in alignment with that? And if you are, even if bad things happen, which they will, being able to feel peace because we're living in ways that are values aligned for me. I have immense privilege in the world in that I have been able to create my own practice, which centers the experiences of people that I'm in community with, and create values that are, for my practice, that are really aligned with my own. Knowing that I'm More times than not, I'm not saying I'm perfect, not by any means, but knowing that more times than not, I'm doing things professionally and hopefully personally that are in alignment with those values, it certainly makes it easier. If something happens and a client comes to me and says, I can't with you, this is out of alignment with me, this is not okay. You checked your phone during so-and-so's presentation at this kink event we were both at, and I can't work with you anymore. If we can talk about it, I'd like to talk about it. That's great. But if that's the decision that person needs to make, that's okay. And I can't necessarily make my decisions about how I'm going to act in those spaces or any space, the dungeon or the grocery store, based on how it might impact how my clients might feel about it.
So we've talked very much about therapists. What about other helping professionals that maybe aren't so restricted with HIPAA and whatnot?
Sure. I think so. Therapy is probably somebody check me on this if you think differently, but therapy, I think, is the furthest along the spectrum with this, because the thing that heals in therapy is the relationship. And so we're always a little extra protective of that relationship in how we go about guarding our interaction with people, right? We're very protective of not only their confidentiality, because obviously I'm not going to share anything anyone tells me outside of the therapy room, but also, yes, it's not to say that I never worry about how people will think about me. It's important that the feeling of care and importance and being seen and heard and valued that people have with me, that they have that consistently, whether they run into me at a dungeon, a grocery store, or whether they're in my office, even though obviously the time I'm giving them is going to be different when it's their hour in my office. I think that changes a little when you think about other helping professionals, because if I think about, for example, a physician, so say somebody's primary care physician, very similar requirements legally in terms of confidentiality. And at the same time, the relationship, while it is of paramount importance, and I some days wish I could go and yell at physical healthcare providers about the importance of developing a relationship with their clients, it is not something that is developed in the same way. And so sometimes that might not be worried about quite so much, right? So, somebody might not feel quite as weird about seeing their doctor, their physical doctor, their primary care physician in some of these spaces as they might their therapist, because people find that they don't feel quite as vulnerable with a physician as they do with a mental health care provider. Different people feel different ways.
Sure.
Then we get into things like, what if it's your physical therapist? What if it's your massage therapist? What if it's your personal trainer? All helpers, all people that often you develop a pretty significant relationship with and may feel very vulnerable with. Different people are going to have different reactions. And there's different requirements for privacy with everything. I think part of the X factor for me there is, well, what does this client need? How are they going to feel about it? The other one is, what does that provider need? Who is that person? Is that provider someone who their professional self is completely separate from their personal life, maybe kinky self? And for some people, that's really important because, there are people who work jobs. Again, I joke that I have a ton of privilege to be myself because I'm my own boss. And so I can be as queer and as kinky as I want to at work and make that part of my brand. A lot of people don't have that privilege and really may fear being out in those ways in professional spaces So what does that mean for somebody who wants to go to a play event, who wants to go to a munch and runs into a client? Might that be as anxiety provoking for that provider as it is for the client?
Fair.
Mm-hmm.
In the introduction, we talked about some of the horror stories.
Yeah.
Give us an example or two.
When I think about the horror stories in my profession, the things I think about are the clients who end up crying in my office, telling me that they have been to other professionals and talked about these pieces of their life. They've talked about their relationship, their dynamics in relationships. They've talked about the pieces of their sex lives that are important to them, and they have been shamed by other providers. That, to me, is the real horror story. It is the thing that frustrates me, saddens me, angers me, and also always makes me really grateful that these people were brave enough to try again with another therapist and ended up in my office. The real horror story for me is shaming people for pieces of their identity, which probably feels like a topic change because it's not quite the same as how do we deal with when we're out in public experiences. But I think the fear of being judged by a provider, a professional, but judged by anyone really, is very present for all of us in the world, right? So I think that's part of the reason that I walk out of a dungeon if I know my clients are engaged in a scene, is because even though my clients know me well and they know that I'm not going to judge them, there's that little creeping fear of what if I'm being judged, which can really detract from being in the moment in a scene. And I don't want to contribute to that. I think that's probably going to happen, especially with people who society puts in places of authority, which is true for physicians, care professionals, lawyers, doctors, all of these folks. And so wanting to break that down and make it clear, like, no, we're here as people too. We are enjoying ourselves. We are probably more worried about our own world than we are about the other people around us. But also wanting to educate you talked about at the very beginning about wanting to educate other providers. I spend as much of my time as I possibly can educating other providers about eliminating bias that is, I think, taught, and also providing competent, not only unbiased, but competent care for sexual, gender, and relational minorities. It could not be more important, because there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in the philosophy of so many people around how we enjoy our physical bodies, how we enjoy interactions around power, sex, sensation, pleasure. And we need to expand that rather than restrict that. So the horror story for me is when we experience shame and blame, whether that's out in public or in a provider's office. And the more we can do to reduce that, the better. The more we can talk about pleasure or desire, whether that is what we desire sexually or just what we want. I feel like the hardest question I ever ask people is, what do you want? If you want to stump somebody, very seriously and very quietly ask them, what do you want? It stumps people not because they don't know the answer, but because they've been taught it is not okay to say, I want blank. And I feel like, especially in the kink community, we've started to normalize literally saying, hello, my name is, I like the following things. I want the following things. I am interested in engaging in the following things. We have formats for it, and that's powerful. We can teach people to do that. When I teach on this topic, I like to to play with my audience a little bit. I like to shock them. And so I have a slide where I put up a question and it says, I dare you to ask me what the kinkiest thing I ever do is. And when I put this up in rooms full of other psychologists or therapists or any providers, you can feel the room tense. They're like, oh God, what's she going to say? What scenes of depravity is she going to describe? And invariably, there's at least one brave soul who's like, okay, what's the kinkiest thing you ever do? And I tell them that I genuinely believe the kinkiest thing that I ever do is talk about sex without shame. I could certainly describe any number of other pieces of my life, but in terms of confounding expectations and breaking social norms, the divorcing of sex from shame may be the most rebellious activity in which I engage. And I think it's powerfully important that we do that. And as providers, we have a little bit of authority, or sometimes a lot of authority in the world, and we have the opportunity to do that. We have the opportunity to be revolutionary in that way.
Definitely.
It's also tiring, and we have to do our own self-care in doing that.
What do you want? Yes, is a very powerful question. And sometimes that's the entire point of therapy, is to figure out what the hell you want.
Yeah, we're all trying to figure it out. I'm still trying to figure it out for myself.
Of course, me and my ADHD, I heard that question, and the first four things that popped into my head were all types of food.
I mean, that is usually my example, because that's the fight that people have most often is like, no, what do you want for dinner?
You also mentioned the shame and blame and such like that. And all I can sit there and think is, a doctor or another professional who walks in and sees a client who's engaged in needle play, and you, from a small town, of being like, dude, but I know you from the doctor's office and you can't stand needles and like you're fearful of them. But here you are in the middle of a dungeon getting your, self all poked with needles with no fear. I mean, it's one of those.
Context is everything.
Absolutely.
Well, and as a person who I started donating blood to try to get over my fear of needles. I can imagine. In fact, I'm fairly certain, if I think back, I definitely have known people who have tried needle play to try to get over that because of the context that we create. Because it happens it's like, okay, I picked a person that I trust. We talked about what was going to happen. There were no surprises. I consented to everything. Consent is power. Yeah, I can absolutely understand that judgment, and also I can see the reason that somebody would engage with that.
Absolutely.
And find healing there. Yeah.
Yeah. I without going into too much detail, have had conversations with a former client who had some rough stuff going on. And for context, I am a community-based mental health caseworker. We'll leave it at that. And so, of course, I'm going back to my supervisor, who is a longtime licensed social worker, and being like, hey, so not totally and completely to out myself, but to out myself, client is talking to me about this, and this, and I'm not being very committal in my responses, only because I'm going, I know that you're not playing safe. So then it's a conversation with my supervisor of, how do I go about this? Because being in of being in the community, of being active in the community. And thank goodness, this client isn't engaging in the same social circles, or former client, I should say.
Sure.
Former client is not engaging in the same social circles. So therefore I'm, not in the risk of outing myself there, but it's how do I engage in this conversation of, hey, you're not playing super safe, and, I know this how.
Yeah. Well, and then did you have to educate your supervisor about this is different from self-harm?
Thankfully, not so much.
Oh, good.
I was lucky enough to have a very open-minded supervisor, very liberal, very open-minded, very much of, I've heard of some things, so my education piece was less than compared with other supervisors that I've had. Well, I'll put it that way.
I mean, but that's the thing that's the other thing that I worry about in terms of horror stories is we're so attuned to have to be alarmed whenever we think we hear anything that might be close to self-harm, that as soon as our alarm bells go off, we get activated and we start thinking about safety planning, but we forget that there are huge spectrums here, and that there's plenty of things that may be harming somebody, but that are not intentionally self-harming. And failing to keep ourselves safe is a really good example of that. And understanding how to talk about that, and it's about managing our own reaction. Like, how do I manage my own reaction when I'm worried about someone I care about?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And then having the background knowledge on top of that from your community is really hard.
Yeah. In this instance, it was having the background knowledge of, hey, if things screw up and go sideways, because of state laws and how they are, you're going to go to jail for a very long time. No questions asked. Yikes. It was one of those type things because of it. And so I'm sitting here engaging in conversation with my supervisor of, how do I tell this client you need to educate yourself? And besides just, hey, you need to educate yourself, because I can say you need to educate yourself and the client could just be like, yeah, okay, whatever, I know what I'm doing. Versus, hey, I recognize because of, some training and education that I have had through various workshops, that this is not safe play, and you could totally and completely screw up your life if not done properly. Being more risk aware, I should say, than what they were. Not necessarily saying, hey, this is unsafe behavior, but at the same time, like, hey, this is completely unsafe behavior because of just the situation as it was. And
this is where I get into talking with people about the idea of what does it mean to be competent to provide care with different communities, right? Like, on the one hand, I joke with people all the time. I say, listen, I work with primarily kinky clients, polyamorous and consensually non-monogamous clients, queer clients, and they'll say, so what do you like? What kind of things do you talk to clients about? And I'm like, well, anxiety and depression, the same as everybody else. The fact that my clients are kinky or queer are anything, that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about the world is on fire. I'm anxious. I'm overwhelmed. I'm tired. I'm parenting. I'm all of these things. And also I want somebody who's going to be an affirming provider for some of the things I'm doing. That said, that's a great example of a place where having some knowledge is really helpful. And I love the model. It's based on some of, this is not necessarily new work, but the Sue and Sue model of cultural competency talks about the idea that we can't know everything, right? There will always be a new kink that I don't know about. There will always be a new idea or word or something.
Sure.
But I need to have some knowledge and be willing to ask difficult questions and know when I don't know things and I need to learn some more. So we can't have no knowledge whatsoever. And so I do think to be competent providers, we do have to be willing to learn, especially for those of us who may not be involved in these communities. We have to learn about, well, what does play look like? What does risk-aware consensual kink look like? How does negotiating boundaries look? And are there better and less good ways to do that? I'm not saying that in order to be competent, one has to be kinky or in the lifestyle or the community to do this, but there's definitely a knowledge base that's needed.
Sure.
That doesn't just spring up out of the belief that we can, that because we care, we can help everybody.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most affirming moments in my professional career, when I really felt like, okay, I'm doing the right thing with my life, and a client, they had been coming in for 6-8 months, and they finally revealed to me that they were into pup play. And instead of doing the generic therapist thing of, okay, tell me more about that, I went, okay, what kind of pup are you?
Mm-hmm.
And just their eyes lit up. Oh my God, I'm not being judged. And this person knows what the hell I'm talking about.
Yes. Yes. It's such a small thing because you're like, wait, I didn't actually do anything, right? I didn't do some magical big intervention tool or trick of my profession. No, I just sat there and was like, cool. Mm-hmm. Tell me more. Like, cool. Tell me about what kind of pup you are. Tell me about your experience in this world. But it's that acceptance, especially at a moment when people fear or maybe in the past have experienced, I call it the therapist ooh face, where they're trying for neutral and people may be trying for neutral, but some micro expression just goes, I don't like that. Or even if the micro expressions are totally neutral, the absence of engagement, people will often interpret that as, I don't like that. Because, of course, many of us who are very hypercritical of ourselves are very good at interpreting criticism and blame, even when in the absence of anything else. So we have to be deliberately affirming.
Oh, yeah.
In order to make clear to people, we're like, awesome. Tell me about your experience of that, because I want to know, tell me about your pup.
Yeah.
Tell me about your leather family. Tell me about your polycule. Tell me about, tell me about the pieces of your life that are important to you and that light you up.
Yeah. And I think some of that also pushes some of the boundaries for some therapists, that when they don't know, that they're having to learn and be comfortable in the uncomfortableness that as a therapist or as a provider, they don't know, especially if they're not aware. And somebody comes out with it and it's like, how do I sit with that?
Yes.
Okay. Just engage in the conversation, even if it's not you, even if it's not your thing as an outside person, as a professional. It's still all about, creating that safe space. And so even if you're unsure, be comfortable in your uncomfortableness of, I don't know.
But I think that's the lesson that we all need to learn, and that we're not necessarily doing a great job teaching. Maybe we're getting better at it now, but I know for me, I was the kid who went straight to grad school. I was the good student. I was the nerdy one who overperformed. And that perfectionism drove me. And people will often say, oh, you accomplished so much, you went and you got your doctorate. And I'm like, yeah, I stayed in school till they gave me a doctorate and kicked me out because it was what I was good at. I was really good at being compliant. I was really good at making professors happy. But what I was fortunate enough to learn in grad school, because I had some professors who saw this, not surprisingly, they were all clinicians.
Mm-hmm.
Along the way there, I was fortunately given the message that the most powerful thing that I could do would be to say, you know what, I don't know, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a message that we are necessarily great at giving. And so I see so often people coming to me, whether it's in lifestyle spaces or in therapy or just in the interactions or in professional training, because I do train a lot of other clinicians, and they're trying to make themselves the perfect whatever it is, the perfect dom, the perfect sub, the perfect pup, the perfect therapist, the perfect client, the perfect child, the perfect anything. And that leaves no space for, I don't know. That leaves no space for the incredible vicissitudes of human life, where most of the time we're not going to know what to expect or how to handle things. And most of the time we are going to have to get creative and figure things out based on whatever tools we have so far and whatever our values are. But this myth that somehow there's a perfect response, and if we don't know what it is, we are wrong or bad or not good enough, it's hurting all of us so much.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And being able to give people permission to break away from that and to say, no. Be authentically you. That's way more powerful than being perfect. But I think that happens so often in all of these spaces. There's no one way for me to be perfectly, a therapist who's also a member of this community. There's just the best that I can do. At some point, it probably has hurt somebody. I have unintentionally hurt someone. I have unintentionally missed something that I need to. The best I can do is acknowledge that and work on it and keep evolving this. Interview me again in 5 years. Maybe I'll have changed what my policy is.
Very fair.
Definitely.
So how has your policy changed over time?
That's a good question. It wasn't as well thought out at the very beginning. It didn't occur to me. I suppose at the very, very beginning, I didn't think about the law of large numbers and Murphy's law in combination, and the reality that someday, of course, I would walk into a dungeon and one of my clients would be, sprawled over a spanking bench or hanging upside down in suspension, and that maybe what do I do would have to cross my mind. So I hadn't thought as clearly about it, and I hadn't thought about how to talk to clients about that. It hadn't occurred to me to say like, oh, this is going to happen ahead of time. So I'm going to talk to my clients and say, this is a place I'm going to be. This is a place maybe you will be. Here's how I handle that. Now, I ended up writing an article about it and putting it on my website because I wanted people to know what to expect or to be able to find it if they went looking for it, or even to use it as a way to start that conversation with their own therapist if they're not one of my clients, if they need it.
How often have you run into clients at events?
I can't. Certainly, I have not been to a local event recently that I haven't run into a client in some way. And it's funny that since COVID, it's kind of changed how it feels, because I've had clients who've gotten really excited that so many of my clients I see virtually now. I have clients who will be like, oh, we're both going to be there. I'll get to hug you. So they're planning on it in some way. So it certainly has. I will say one of the most difficult ones was recently. It happened, and I had a client who ended up was having a really difficult time at that event. And so we both had to work to maintain boundaries and recognize, like, I care that you're having a challenging weekend, and also I am not working this weekend. So that person let me know that they were having a hard time, and also did not make it my responsibility to like stop what I was doing and like do a session with them. So my client really did a really good job navigating boundaries with me. But that's an important thing too, right? Understanding that
Sure.
Yeah.
if I'm in the same space, especially because often I'm teaching or doing, volunteering in some way for these events, that I can't just step out of that and put on my therapist hat and, go find a space and do a session. And so having to understand that, and my clients have done a really great job with that recently. But I have everything in those interactions, from clients who come up and say hi to me and have been looking forward to saying hello, to folks who, we don't lock eyes because that's not what they need, and that's okay. And we talk about that. We talk about that too. I always want to check in with people and say, hey, was that how did you feel about that? Did you want me to handle that any way differently? Because it gives people the opportunity to withdraw or change their consent.
I can't help but feel like kinky poly clients are better at respecting the boundaries when you run into them out in the wild than a vanilla client.
I have long said that I think there's a lot that the vanilla monogamous world can potentially learn from kink and polyamory. And a lot of that is around having intentional communication about consent, boundaries, expectations, all of these things that we joke about, like we don't have more sex, we just have more communication about it. I also want to recognize when I say that's recognizing that on average, those things are true. I know plenty of people who are very intentionally and ethically monogamous and deliberate and have great communication, and that's a real relationship strength. But I think broadly, we talk as a community, and we have some community values that, boy, I want to spread to the world in a big, big way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely some relationship stuff that I have picked up from the community that I use with my vanilla clients. And
Absolutely. And in my own relationship, like, I'm better for being a part of this community. That is for sure.
yeah. I mean, I changed the words a little bit, so I'm not saying, dominant and submissive. I'm saying who's in control and who likes to go along for the ride.
Yep. Well, and what are, people often have so many expectations, so many unspoken expectations about, but isn't that just what a relationship is? You ask 7 different people about what they assume a relationship is, and you will get 7 different answers.
Sometimes 8 if you have, somebody who's slightly indecisive.
Right? They'll have, well, this is what my mom thought it was, this is what my dad thought it was, this is what the rest of my family thought it was. There's so many, we're all just a product of what we know, but there is so much else out there. And so I think when we stop just doing automatic kind of, when we stop functioning on autopilot and start thinking about, wait, why do I do the things I do? Why do I expect the things I expect? Then we can make very deliberate choices.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's getting to be about that time. Is there anything else you feel like you need to share or want to share on this topic before we wrap up?
My favorite thing to talk about, I joke all the time with people. I say, well, listen, I'm a happy victim of the cult of communication and consent. And I always will be, because I think that if there's anything that we need more of in the world, it is communication and consent. And I find myself talking about that anywhere that I'm doing work. I talk about it with individuals. I talk about it with relationships. I talk about it with organizations when I'm working there and looking at, why people are feeling frustrated in the organizations they're working in, things like that. I think there's so much that we can learn from good relationship models anywhere, where people are honored for who they are and seen for their unique selves, and then asked, well, what do you need in order to feel, we think about it in terms of kink. We think, okay, well, what do you need in order to feel pleasure and get what you want out of this interaction? But also, what do you need to thrive and to function in this situation? What do you need there to be in this experience, but also what do you need to not have here? I think that's such a powerful model. I work with, obviously not only kinky, queer, and polyamorous folks, but I work with a very neurodiverse population. I myself was kind of late to realize that I am autistic, and I work with a lot of folks for whom that's true too, and realizing that we experience the world differently, recognizing that maybe we need a different kind of care than we anticipated or than everybody expected for us early in our lives. I think sometimes that's part of the attraction of the choose your own adventure of kink, of polyamory, of intentional communities. And all of that is empowering. And I love that we get to talk about and empower people in the work that we do. So let's just keep empowering each other.
Absolutely. I like that. So this has come up on other shows, previous episodes, I should say. What is your take on the Venn diagram between kinky and or poly and neurodiverse?
I am in the middle.
How much overlap do you think there is between those communities?
Yes. No, I understand the question, but also the overlap is me.
Yeah. Same.
I be it. I do think there's overlap. I don't think it's not a circle, obviously. It's not 100% a circle, but I definitely think there is a lot of overlap. And I will tell you the best thing about my life is that, sorry for the sound effects, I'm literally clapping my hands with glee here. The best thing about my life is that overlap is where I get to work, that those are the clients that I get to work with, because that's just how my world has developed and how people have found their way to me. I can't express the joy in being able to give somebody the experience of saying to me, clients hopefully coming to me, saying to me, revealing to me over time, hey, I'm neurodiverse, I'm kinky, I'm polyamorous, I'm, and list other things that maybe they've been judged for in the past. I'm thinking about, I work with a lot of very geeky, hyperfixated clients, love my nerds. We've got a big nerd vibe going in our practice. People who are, different sensory experiences, all kinds of different things. And I love that I get to sit and say, that's amazing and wonderful. That's your superpower, even though I know it can feel like it's your kryptonite in the world that we live in. And how can I support you? And how can we embrace self-love and self-acceptance and turn that into power in the world? So I do think there's a huge overlap, and I love that place. Yeah. Those are my favorite people.
I mean, my casual observation, 90% of kinky and poly people are some sort of neurodiverse, if not more.
I think because it's a place where we talk about what we need, and we talk deliberately and are open to hearing things, it's a place where it can be safer to be neurodiverse, as opposed to a world where the expectation is that everybody will need or want the same thing, which can feel extremely uncomfortable or unwelcoming to neurodiverse folks. Because the diverse is the most important word there, is that we're all different and we don't all need or want the same thing.
Absolutely. Okay, if somebody wants to contact you or follow you on social media, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. So I own a practice called Storybrooke, Storie, because I am a weirdo and I like books and Old English spellings. Storybrooke Therapy and Consulting. Like I said, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, but I can work virtually in a lot of the country. And it's I have a couple other people who work with me, but it's not a big corporate practice. So we try to do as much as we can in terms of outreach. We see clients and there's a limit to how much we can do there, but I manage our social medias so that we can just put out little bits of information that might be useful to people, self-care reminders, sex positive reminders, all kinds of things like that. And most of our social medias are at StoryBrookTX, StorieBrookTX. So that's like Facebook, Instagram. We're not on the evil X because, we're trying to divorce from the billionaires. It's hard, but we'll work on it. But we try to put out some content that may help people. Sometimes it's stuff about how to find a therapist, which we know is really difficult. So we're always happy to help people with finding the resources they need, because that can be a really big question for people. How do I find an affirming therapist? So there's resources on our website, which is just www.storybrook.com. And people are always welcome to find me and ask questions. I love talking to our people.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been a great guest. And
My pleasure.
I've enjoyed talking about this with you. For our listeners, upcoming SINagogue in-person and virtual classes, Electric Mayhem 1 and 2, Electroplay with the Violet Wand, Electroplay without the Violet Wand, Bratty Daddies, and more, both in-person and virtual. Check out our website for the details. Remember, gang, your kinks are nothing to be ashamed of, unless, of course, you have a humiliation fetish, in which case you should be very, very ashamed, you dirty little pervert. But that's it. That's our show. Say goodnight, little bit.
Good night, little bit.
Follow us on Facebook, FetLife, Twitter, Tumblr, and YouTube as SINagogue BDSM, and on Instagram and TikTok as SINagogue Kink. If you enjoyed or learned something from this podcast, consider making a donation via PayPal, Cash App, Venmo, Patreon, or Ko-fi. Username SINagogue, or find those links to all of those on our website, SINagogueBDSM.com. Remember, that's SINagogue with an I. Also on the website, links to past episodes, upcoming classes, book us as educators, shop our store, and more.
SINagogue hosts and guests are subject matter experts but are not the expert. We believe that, outside of violating consent, there is no wrong way to do kink, except to think your way is the only way. This show is presented from a RAC, risk-aware consensual kink point of view, and not SSC, safe, sane, consensual, because every individual's definition of safe is different based on their own risk profile. The use of the word safe on this show fits our definition of safe, and that does not have to be your definition. Opinions expressed by guests on the show are those of the person expressing the opinion, not of the show.
Just a reminder, we try to make our content as inclusive as possible, regardless of gender, orientation, role in the lifestyle, etc. But we do inherently speak from our own point of view. For the most part, substitute our identity with your own to make it work. We want to know when we make a mistake, so we can learn and grow from those mistakes. So if you feel like we did say something that is genuinely offensive, we encourage you to let us know. Reach out to us with your questions, comments, or concerns via our website or call us at 469-269-0403.
Brought to you today by the letters and the number.
San Diego High School Football Room!